Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's fairy tale, only to realize it was about to turn into a nightmare? For over 40 years, I lived my life as a quiet architect of other people's success, building a monument of reputation for my husband and later for my only son. I prided myself on his achievements, watching him climb the social and professional ladders of Germany's elite, until one chance encounter at the edge of his sprawling estate ripped the mask right off his face. It happened on a night draped in a thick, gray fog, the kind that swallows the Bavarian hills and turns the familiar into something spectral. That night, I saw something that turned my son and me into enemies forever. But when you see the person you raised with your own hands prioritize a cold piece of jewelry over a human soul, you don't really have a choice at all. Hello to everyone listening. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 62 years old, and I never imagined I would have to tell a story this painful. I spent my whole life as an honest head nurse in a busy municipal hospital, working double shifts and believing that integrity was something you passed down through your bloodline like a precious heirloom. How bitterly wrong I was. Please forgive me if my voice shakes. It is still hard for me to recall the details of that evening, but I want to tell you everything straight from the heart so you can understand why I did what I did, something many would call a betrayal of family. As I tell you this, I keep thinking that maybe you are listening from thousands of miles away in the silence of your own home. Please let me know in the comments where you are from, what city or state you call home. It means a lot to me to know that there are people out there willing to share this heavy burden with me. Whether you are in a bustling city like Berlin, a quiet town in the Black Forest, or somewhere across the ocean in the Midwest, that evening started out like any other dragging, cold night until a single glint of light shattered my entire world. For the last 3 years, I have lived in a small, modest cottage on the far edge of a massive equestrian estate owned by my son, Julian. Julian is 38 now, a high-flying lawyer with a flawless reputation, currently eyeing a prestigious seat as a federal judge. Everything about him radiates power, control, and an almost clinical perfection. His wife, Madeline, is the daughter of a prominent industrialist, and their marriage always felt more like a strategic merger of two powerful dynasties than a union of hearts. They live in the main manor, a glass and stone masterpiece that looks like a fortress of modern wealth. When my husband passed away, Julian insisted I move onto the grounds. He told me, "Mother, sell the family house. Why live in that old drafty place alone? Come live in the steward's cottage. You can breathe the fresh air, walk among the horses, and be close to us." I sold my home, put the money into a savings account for a rainy day, and settled into the cottage. To ensure I didn't feel like a freeloading guest, I took over the light maintenance of the perimeter and the waste management for the lower grounds. My hands were built for work, and idleness felt like a prison sentence. I took pride in keeping the edges of the woods clean and the paths clear. To an outsider, it looked like I had found peace and a comfortable retirement next to my successful son. But as the months passed, my heart felt a little heavier. I didn't feel like the matriarch of the family. I felt like a relic, an old servant allowed to live on the master's plantation out of a sense of obligation. Behind the closed doors of their mansion, there was a cold emptiness that no amount of expensive art could fill. Their main problem, the one they never spoke about out loud, was their inability to have children. I could see how it was eating Madeline alive, turning a beautiful woman into a bundle of frayed nerves and silent resentments. The fog that evening was particularly dense, clinging to the damp earth and muffling the sounds of the nearby highway. I was walking toward the large industrial bins near the service entrance to dispose of my weekly trash. The air was biting, and I was eager to get back to the warmth of my fireplace. As I reached the bins, I noticed a black trash bag that had been snagged on the sharp metal edge of the container. It was ripped open, its contents spilling out onto the gravel. Usually the house staff handled the manor's waste, but this bag looked out of place, as if someone had tried to hide it deep in the bin and failed. I leaned down to pick up the loose items, intending to tie the bag back together. That was when I saw it. Tucked between a discarded wine bottle and some shredded documents, something caught the pale light of my flashlight. It was a rhythmic, brilliant shimmer that didn't belong in the trash. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly from the cold, and pulled out a heavy, platinum-set diamond necklace. My breath hitched in my throat. I recognized it immediately. It was the Eternal Star Necklace, a piece Julian had gifted Madeline for their 5th anniversary. It was worth at least $50,000. I had seen her wear it at gala events, the diamonds dancing against her throat, a symbol of the Vance family's unassailable status. I stood there in the gray silence, the cold weight of the jewelry pressing into my palm. Why was a small fortune sitting in a bag of refuse? My mind, always wanting to find a logical explanation for the son I loved, whispered that it must have been an accident. Perhaps it had fallen off during a party or been swept off of vanity by a careless maid. But as I turned the necklace over in the beam of my light, I saw a dark, brownish smear on the clasp. It was blood, dried, crusty, and unmistakable. A chill that had nothing to do with the Bavarian winter sent a shudder down my spine. The intuition I had developed over decades on the hospital floor told me that this wasn't a loss. It was a disposal. The silence of the estate suddenly felt sinister. I looked up at the main house, its silhouette a dark, jagged shape against the fog. The windows were mostly dark, except for the faint blue glow of Julian's study. Up there, my son was likely preparing his next legal brief, maintaining the facade of the perfect, law-abiding citizen. Down here, in the dirt and the damp, I was holding a piece of evidence that suggested a violence I couldn't yet name. At that moment, I realized I wasn't just a mother or a retired nurse anymore. I was a witness. I tucked the necklace deep into the pocket of my heavy coat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The mask of perfection was beginning to crack, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that once I looked through the fissures, my world would never be the same again. This was the beginning of the end of my peace, and the start of a journey into a darkness I never thought my own blood was capable of creating. The diamond necklace felt like a piece of ice in my pocket, its sharp edges pressing against my thigh as I stood frozen in the thickening fog. I looked down at the gravel, where the trail of trash from the ripped bag didn't just stop at the bin. A few crumpled papers and a discarded silk scarf led away from the service entrance, trailing toward the dense thicket of pines that bordered the old storage shed. This shed was a relic from the original farm, a heavy timber structure with a rusted iron door that had been padlocked and forgotten for over 3 years. Julian had told me the foundations were rotting and that he had lost the key years ago, forbidding anyone from going near it for safety reasons. But as I stood there, a sound drifted through the mist that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the shifting of the horses in the distance. It was a rhythmic, desperate scratching, like fingernails clawing against dry wood. I followed the sound, my boots crunching softly on the frozen needles of the pine floor. The closer I got to the shed, the more the scratching was joined by a low, rhythmic whimpering, a sound of such profound exhaustion and pain that it bypassed my brain and went straight to my instincts as a nurse. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it was a trapped fox, or perhaps a stray dog that had found a way inside, but the scratching was too high up on the door, too deliberate. I reached the heavy oak door and placed my hand on the cold, damp wood. The scratching stopped instantly. A silence followed that was so heavy it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Then, a muffled, choked groan came from the other side, followed by a faint, raspy whisper that sounded like it was being dragged through gravel. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gray darkness, illuminating the rusted padlock and the deep gouges in the wood around the frame. I moved the light to the narrow, vertical gap where the door had begun to rot away from the stone foundation. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and the glint of spiderwebs. But as I adjusted the angle, the light hit something wet and reflective. I gasped and nearly dropped the phone. Two eyes, wide and bloodshot, were staring back at me from the darkness of the shed. They were eyes filled with a terror so pure it felt like a physical blow to my chest. I leaned closer, the beam of my light finally steadying on the figure behind the gap. There, huddled on a pile of moldy blankets in the corner of the structure, was a woman. Her face was gray and hollowed out, her skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones like parchment over a skull. Her hair was a matted, colorless tangle, and her clothes were little more than rags held together by grime. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. I recognized her. Despite the years of decay and the mask of filth, I knew those eyes. This was Clara, the brilliant, vibrant young woman who had served as Julian's private secretary for years. 3 years ago, she had vanished without a trace. Julian had told the police, the press, and me that she had embezzled funds and fled the country to escape prosecution. He had acted the part of the betrayed employer so perfectly that no one had ever doubted his word. "Clara?" I whispered, my voice cracking in the cold air. The woman flinched at the sound of her name, pulling back into the shadows and shielding her eyes from the light. She began to shake violently, her teeth chattering so loudly I could hear them through the wood. She didn't speak. She only made a soft, keening sound in the back of her throat. I realized then that the trash bag I had found wasn't just a discarded accident. The scarf, the documents, and even the necklace were part of a life that was being systematically erased, or perhaps a desperate attempt to signal the world outside. The diamond necklace in my pocket now felt like a heavy stone of guilt. My son, the man who was supposed to uphold the law, had turned this shed into a tomb for a living soul. I looked around the clearing, half expecting Julian to step out of the fog with that calm, calculating smile of his. The estate felt like a different world now, not a sanctuary of success, but a sprawling crime scene hidden in plain sight. I tried to pull on the padlock, but it wouldn't budge. I spoke to her again, trying to use my calmest nursing voice, the one I used for patients who were waking up from a nightmare. "Clara, it's Eleanor, Julian's mother. I'm going to get you out. I promise you, I'm going to get you out." She didn't respond with words, but she pressed her face back against the gap, her breath fogging the air between us. The sight of her jacquard features so close to the light burned an image into my mind that I knew would haunt me until the day I died. In that moment, the visual core of my life shifted. I didn't see the emerald lawns or the prize-winning horses anymore. All I could see was that gray, skeletal face peering through a crack in the wood of my son's property. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to be kind to animals and to always tell the truth, was keeping a human being in a cage. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the full weight of the situation settled into my bones. If I left her here to find help, would Julian find out? If I went to the police now, would his connections stifle the investigation before it even began? I looked at the shed, then at the main house glowing in the distance. The man in that house was a monster, and I had been the one who helped build his pedestal. I knew I couldn't walk away. I had to find a way to break that lock, but more than that, I had to find a way to break the hold Julian had over my life. The scratching started again, softer this time, a plea for mercy that I could no longer ignore. My son and I were no longer on the same side. The war for the truth had begun. The iron padlock was cold and rusted, biting into my palms as I yanked at it with a strength I didn't know I still possessed. My breath came in ragged gasps, clouding the freezing air as I looked around the damp forest floor for anything to use as a lever. I found a heavy, discarded iron pry bar near a stack of rotting fence posts and wedged it into the hasp of the door. With a desperate, bone-wrenching heave, the wood groaned and splintered. The metal screech of the bolt giving way echoed through the silent pines like a gunshot. I kicked the door open, the heavy oak swinging back on its hinges to reveal a darkness so thick it felt like a physical wall. The smell hit me immediately, a suffocating mix of damp hay, old waste, and the metallic tang of unwashed bodies. I stepped inside, the beam of my phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. Clara was huddled in the far corner, shielding her face from the sudden intrusion of light. She was trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together, a hollow sound in the small space. But as my eyes adjusted and the light swept across the floor, I realized she wasn't alone. Tucked behind her, partially hidden by a tattered wool blanket and a pile of graying straw, was a small, motionless bundle. My heart stopped. I moved closer, my boots sinking into the soft, rotting floorboards. I knelt down, ignoring the filth, and gently pulled back the edge of the blanket. There, curled into a tight ball, was a little girl. She looked to be about 2 years old. Though her body was so frail and thin, she appeared much younger. Her skin was a pale, translucent gray, and her hair was a thin, wispy blonde. She didn't cry. She only stared at me with huge, sunken eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sorrow. She was clutching a small, dirty rag doll to her chest, her tiny fingers locked in a grip of pure survival. As I reached out to touch her forehead, checking for the fever I feared was there, her sleeve slipped back. My blood turned to ice. On the underside of her tiny wrist was a vivid, reddish-purple birthmark in the distinct shape of a flickering flame. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to press my hand against the dirt-streaked wall to keep from collapsing. I knew that mark. I had spent hours kissing that exact same flame on Julian's wrist when he was an infant 38 years ago. It was a rare, hereditary mark that had been in the Vance family for generations. There was no room for doubt, no space for a mother's denial. This child was Julian's daughter. My own granddaughter had been born and kept in a shed like an unwanted animal, while her father lived in a glass mansion just a few hundred yards away. "Clara," I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of grief and rising fury. How long have you been in here?" Clara finally lowered her hands, her hollow eyes meeting mine. She reached out and pulled the child closer to her chest, a primal, protective instinct that transcended her own exhaustion. The little girl whimpered, a thin, weak sound that tore through my soul. Clara's lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she spoke, her voice was nothing more than a ghostly rasp that seemed to come from the depths of a grave. "3 winters, Eleanor," she said, each word a struggle. "He brought me here when I told him I wouldn't get rid of her. He said he would take care of us, that he just needed time to fix things with Madeline and the firm. But then the door stayed locked. He told me that the world believed I was a thief, a fugitive. He said if I ever tried to scream, if I ever tried to step foot outside this door, he would find a way to make sure the police never found us." He told me. She stopped, a sob racking her thin frame. She looked down at the child, stroking the girl's matted hair with a skeletal hand. "He said if I stepped out of here, he would take the very last breath from her body. He said a dead daughter was better for his career than a bastard one." I sat back on my heels, the flashlight rolling from my hand and illuminating the ceiling. The sheer, calculated cruelty of my son's words felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a 3-year campaign of psychological and physical torture against a woman he had once claimed to care for and a child who carried his own blood. Julian, the man who spoke about justice and the sanctity of the law in televised debates, had threatened to murder his own flesh and blood to protect a seat on a judicial bench. I looked at the little girl again. She was staring at the light on the ceiling, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. She was the eternal star of this story, a hidden light that Julian had tried to extinguish. I realized then that my life of priding myself on his success was a lie built on a foundation of corpses. Every achievement he had, every award on his wall, was paid for with the suffering of this woman and this child. The diamond necklace in my pocket, the one with the blood on the clasp, must have been dropped during one of his rare, cold visits to this prison, perhaps during a struggle, perhaps as a final insult. "We have to leave." "Now," I said, my voice hardening with a resolve I had never felt before. I stood up and reached out my arms. Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the open door with a terror that had been bred into her over 1,000 dark nights. She looked at the forest outside as if the trees themselves were sentinels for Julian. I won't let him hurt her. I promised, looking her straight in the eye. I am his mother, and I am telling you, he will have to go through me to get to either of you. Clara looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for any trace of the son I had raised. Finding none, she slowly placed the child in my arms. The girl was frighteningly light, her bones feeling as fragile as a bird's. She didn't resist. She simply tucked her head into the crook of my neck, her small, cold hand brushing against my cheek. As I stepped out of the shed and into the biting Bavarian fog, carrying the secret that would destroy my family, I felt a bridge collapse behind me. There was no going back to being the proud mother of a successful lawyer. From this moment on, I was a protector, a conspirator, and an enemy to my own blood. I began the long, silent walk back to my cottage, praying that the shadows would keep us hidden just long enough to find a way out of this nightmare. I brought them into my small cottage under the cover of the dense, swirling fog, moving like a thief on my own son's land. Clara was so weak she could barely put one foot in front of the other, her breath coming in shallow, terrified rasps, while the little girl clung to me with a silent, haunting desperation. I settled them in the back bedroom, the one I usually kept for storage, drawing the heavy velvet curtains tight against the night. I fed them warm broth and bread, watching as Clara flinched at every creak of the floorboards, her eyes darting to the door as if Julian might burst through at any second. After they finally fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep, I sat by the window and watched the blue glow of the main manor on the hill. My mind was a storm of grief and disbelief, but I knew I couldn't act on emotion alone. I needed to see his face. I needed to hear the lie from his own lips before I declared war on my only child. The next morning broke gray and somber, the Bavarian sky matching the heavy dread in my chest. I made a simple breakfast for Clara and the child, strictly instructing them to stay away from the windows and to remain as silent as shadows. I locked the cottage door from the outside and began the long, uphill walk toward the manor. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, a sound that usually felt like the rhythm of a peaceful retirement, but now sounded like a countdown to a confrontation. As I climbed the marble steps of the main entrance, the sheer opulence of the estate felt offensive. Every manicured hedge and polished stone seemed to scream of the cruelty hidden just a few hundred yards away in that rotting shed. I found Julian on the terrace, bathed in the soft morning light. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking every bit the prestigious lawyer and the future federal judge the country expected him to be. He was sitting at a glass table, a crystal glass of deep red wine in his hand despite the early hour, and a thick stack of legal dossiers spread out before him. He looked so calm, so utterly composed, a man who owned the world and everyone in it. When he heard my footsteps, he didn't look up immediately. He simply took a slow, methodical sip of his wine, the sunlight catching the gold of his watch. "Good morning, Mother," he said, his voice smooth and resonant, the very same voice that charmed juries and commanded respect in the highest courts. "You're up early. Is there something wrong with the cottage? I told the maintenance crew to check the heating yesterday." I stood at the edge of the terrace, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, clutching the diamond necklace I had found in the trash. The weight of it felt like a burning coal. I watched him for a moment, trying to find a trace of the little boy who used to cry when he fell off his bicycle, the boy I had taught to always be honest. But the man sitting there was a stranger, a polished statue of ambition. "I wanted to ask you about someone, Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's been on my mind lately. Do you remember Clara? Your old secretary?" The air on the terrace seemed to turn to ice instantly. Julian's hand, which had been reaching for a page of his dossier, paused for a fraction of a second. It was a tell so subtle that only a mother would notice it. He slowly set his glass down, the fine crystal clinking against the tabletop like a sharp, metallic warning. He turned his head toward me, his eyes narrowing into slits of cold, sharp calculation. The warmth that usually inhabited his face when he spoke to me was gone, replaced by a clinical, predatory stillness. "Clara?" he repeated, his lip curling slightly as if he had bitten into something bitter. "Why on earth are you bringing her up now, Mother? That was years ago. It's a closed chapter. I just wondered if you ever heard from her. I lied, forced to play his game of shadows. People say she was pregnant when she disappeared. I felt bad for her. She was so young and she seemed so dedicated to you. Julian let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any hint of genuine mirth. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs with an air of practiced indifference, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He picked up a silver pen and began to click it rhythmically, a sound that felt like a ticking time bomb. Dedicated? He sneered. Mother, don't be so naive. You always were too soft-hearted. Clara was a deeply disturbed woman, a kleptomaniac, and a pathological liar. She had a history of drug use that she managed to hide during the interview process. When Madeline and I caught her stealing jewelry and embezzling from the firm's private accounts, we were going to call the police. But out of pity for her family, we just fired her and gave her a chance to leave quietly. Instead, she had a psychotic break. She made up those ridiculous stories about an affair and a pregnancy to try and blackmail me. It's a classic move for people of her sort. When they get caught, they try to drag the successful man down with them. I stared at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt a wave of genuine horror. He was lying to me, his own mother, with a level of precision that was terrifying. He wasn't even blinking. He had crafted this narrative so thoroughly that he had likely begun to believe it himself. I looked into his eyes and saw no righteous anger, no sadness for a fallen colleague, only a slimy, calculating fear covered by a thick layer of arrogance. "Is that so?" I whispered. "So you never saw her again after she left?" Julian stood up abruptly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over me. He took a step closer, and the metallic tone of a man used to giving orders took over his voice. "She vanished, Mother. Likely ran off to some backwoods village to squander the money she stole before the police could catch up with her. And quite frankly, I don't want to hear her name in this house again. We are in the middle of a major campaign. The opposition is looking for any crack in our armor, any ghost to haunt us. If people like her try to resurface with their lies, they will be handled professionally." He looked at me then, not as a son looks at a parent, but as a prosecutor looks at a hostile witness. It was a look of pure, unadulterated warning. He was telling me to stay in my lane, to keep my mouth shut, and to continue playing the role of the proud, silent mother in the background of his success. He patted my shoulder, a gesture that used to feel like affection but now felt like the heavy hand of a master keeping a dog in line. "Go back to your cottage, Mother," he said, his voice returning to that chillingly calm cadence. "Enjoy the gardens. Leave the messy business of the world to me. I've worked too hard for this seat to let a dead scandal ruin it." He turned back to his dossiers, dismissing me entirely. As I walked away from the manor, my heart felt like a shriveled leaf. I knew now that there was no room for negotiation. My son was a man who saw human beings as obstacles to be removed. As I descended the steps, I reached into my pocket and felt the sharp diamonds of the necklace. I knew what I had to do. The bridge was gone, and the war for Clara and the little girl had truly begun. He thought he was protecting his future, but he had no idea that his own mother was about to become his greatest judge. I descended the marble steps of the manor with a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. Julian's dismissal followed me like a shadow, his polished lies ringing in my ears. I knew my son's truth. It was a carefully constructed fortress designed to protect his ambition, but I had seen the cracks in the foundation. Back at the cottage, I watched Clara and the little girl from the doorway. They were eating silently, moving with the exaggerated caution of people who had spent years trying to be invisible. Every time a branch scraped against the window, Clara's shoulders would hunch, her eyes darting toward the lock I had replaced. I looked at the little girl, whose frail hand still bore that unmistakable flame-shaped birthmark, and I knew that Julian's words about kleptomania and drug use were nothing more than poison meant to paralyze my conscience. I could not take his word, but I also could not act on instinct alone. In Julian's world, facts were weapons, and I needed a weapon of my own. I went to the back room and knelt beside the child. With a pair of sewing scissors and a gentle whisper, I snipped a small lawn talk, a lock of her thin flaxen hair, and tucked it into a sterile plastic pouch. Then, I pulled the Eternal Star necklace from my coat pocket. I looked closely at the clasp, where the dark, brownish smear of dried blood remained. If Julian had struggled with Clara, if he had used force to keep her in that shed, his DNA might be trapped in that very stain. I wrapped the necklace in a clean silk handkerchief, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip my wrists to steady them. I knew I couldn't go to a local clinic. Julian's influence in this region was absolute. He had friends in the police department, the judiciary, and the medical boards. If I stepped into a lab within 50 miles of the estate, he would know before I even left the parking lot. I told Clara to bolt the door and not to answer for anyone, not even for me, unless she heard our secret knock. I climbed into my old, battered Volvo, the one Julian had repeatedly tried to replace with a newer, GPS-tracked model, and drove out through the rear service gate. I headed north, putting distance between myself and the lie I had lived for 38 years. I drove nearly 200 miles to a private forensic laboratory in a cold, industrial city where no one knew the Vance name. The drive was a blur of gray highways and skeletal trees, my mind replaying every fishing trip, every birthday, and every proud moment I had shared with Julian. I kept asking myself where I had failed. Was the rot always there, hidden beneath his charming smile, or had the pursuit of power simply stripped away his humanity? I arrived at the lab, a sterile, anonymous building that smelled of ozone and sharp chemicals. The technician behind the glass looked at me with clinical indifference as I handed over the pouches. I didn't give my real name. I paid in cash nearly 4,000 euros from my rainy day savings to expedite the results. The blood on the jewelry and the hair sample, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I need a paternity match, and I need it fast. The technician nodded, quoting a 72-hour turnaround for the rush fee. Those 72 hours became a descent into a private hell. I drove back to the estate that same night, arriving under the cover of darkness to find Clara and the child still safe, though the girl's cough was becoming deeper, more raspy. Over the next 3 days, I lived a double life that felt like a slow-motion car crash. By day, I walked the grounds, pruning the dead heads off the winter roses and raking the gravel paths, playing the role of the submissive, aging mother. I watched Julian from a distance. On the second evening, a news crew arrived at the manor. I stood by the stables, hidden in the shadows, as the cameras rolled. Julian stood on the terrace with Madeline by his side, her hand tucked perfectly into the crook of his arm. He was glowing, the very image of a devoted husband and a principled leader. He spoke to the reporter about restoring the moral fabric of our courts and protecting the vulnerable. I watched his face on the small monitor the crew had set up. Seeing the warmth in his eyes and the sincerity in his tone, it was a masterpiece of deception. Just a few hundred yards away, the mother of his child was shivering in my spare bedroom, her spirit broken by the very man who was currently preaching about family values to 10 million viewers. The irony was sickening. It felt as if the air on the estate was thickening with the weight of his hypocrisy. Every time Julian looked toward my cottage with that patronizing, dutiful son wave, I felt a surge of nausea. I would nod back, a hollow smile plastered on my face, while my soul screamed at the injustice of it all. I looked at Madeline, whose face was a mask of expensive makeup and repressed sadness. Did she know? Or was she just another victim of the Vance perfection, a woman being used as a prop in a play she didn't realize was a tragedy? At night, I sat in the dark with Clara, listening to her tell fragments of her story, how the Eternal Star necklace had been the last thing he gave her before the door was locked for the first time, a cruel joke of a gift offered during a struggle she could never win. She told me how he would visit once a month, bringing just enough food to keep them alive, but not enough to give them the strength to fight back. Each story was a nail in the coffin of my relationship with my son. I spent those nights staring at my phone, waiting for the notification from the lab. I was terrified of what the paper would say, but I was more terrified of what would happen if it said nothing at all. I was a mother waiting for the evidence to prove her son was a monster, a betrayal of nature that felt like a weight crushing my very bones. The third day broke with a low, heavy fog, and as the hours ticked toward evening, my phone finally buzzed in my pocket. The moment of truth had arrived, and I knew that once I opened that file, the Eleanor Vance who prided herself on her son's success would be dead forever. The third day ended with a sky the color of a bruised plum, and as the shadows of the Bavarian pines stretched long and jagged across my cottage floor, my phone finally buzzed with a sharp, insistent notification. My hands were slick with cold sweat as I fumbled to unlock the screen. I opened the encrypted file from the forensic lab, my vision blurring for a moment before the black text snapped into focus. Probability of paternity, 99.8%. There it was, laid out in clinical, indisputable numbers. The blood on the Eternal Star necklace was Julian's, and the DNA in the child's hair was a perfect match. The son I had raised, the man the world heralded as a paragon of justice, was indeed the jailer of his own flesh and blood. A single, hot tear rolled down my cheek, not for the loss of my son's reputation, but for the death of the man I thought I knew. My son was gone. In his place stood a calculating stranger who had allowed his child to rot in a shed for the sake of a judicial bench. I didn't have time to mourn. Before I could even process the crushing weight of the evidence, a sharp, ragged gasp from the back bedroom shattered the silence. I dropped the phone and ran toward the sound. Clara was huddled on the floor, her face a mask of pure hysteria, clutching the little girl to her chest. The child was no longer shivering. She was stiff, her tiny limbs jerking in violent, rhythmic spasms. Her eyes had rolled back, leaving only the whites visible, and a thin foam was forming at the corners of her mouth. I reached out and touched her forehead, and the heat radiating from her skin felt like a furnace. This wasn't just a cold or a lingering cough. This was a body reaching its breaking point after years of malnutrition and untreated infection. "She's burning up, Eleanor. She's not breathing right," Clara screamed, her voice breaking into a jagged sob. As a retired nurse, I knew exactly what I was looking at: a febrile seizure brought on by a skyrocketing temperature and a systemic infection that had finally taken hold of her fragile lungs. If I didn't get her to a high-level emergency room immediately, her heart would simply stop. I looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m. The main manor was dark, but I knew the security gates were monitored by cameras that fed directly to Julian's tablet. I couldn't call an ambulance to the estate. Julian would intercept it before it reached the cottage. I had to move, and I had to move now. "Get your things, Clara, now!" I barked, my nursing instincts taking over the grief. I didn't wait for her to respond. I grabbed a heavy wool blanket and wrapped the convulsing child tightly to keep her from injuring herself. I threw a few essentials, the DNA results, the necklace, and my savings book into a bag. Outside, the weather had turned treacherous. A cold, torrential rain was lashing against the windows, turning the gravel paths into rivers of mud. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like a choir of mourning voices. I led Clara out the back door, staying low in the shadows of the lilac bushes. We avoided the main driveway and headed for the old lean-to shed where I kept my vintage Jeep, a rugged, open-topped vehicle Julian had always hated because it didn't fit the prestigious image of the family. The rain was so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of me, and the mud pulled at our boots like grasping hands. Clara was stumbling, her breath coming in panicked gasps, but I gripped her arm with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I shoved her into the passenger seat and laid the child across her lap. The girl had stopped convulsing, but she was now terrifyingly limp, her breathing sounding like wet gravel shifting in a tin can. I climbed into the driver's seat and pumped the gas pedal. The engine coughed, a hollow, metallic sound that seemed to echo through the entire valley. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Please," I whispered to the rusted dashboard, "just this once." On the third try, the engine roared to life, spewing a cloud of dark smoke into the rain. I didn't turn on the headlights. I knew the terrain of the estate by heart, and any spark of light would alert the security detail at the main house. I shifted into gear and swung the Jeep around, steering it through the high grass and the dense thicket of oaks that bordered the back perimeter. The Jeep jolted and bounced over the uneven ground, the suspension screaming as we hit hidden rocks and deep ruts. Branches clawed at the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers, and the rain drenched us through the gaps in the canvas top, but I didn't slow down. I looked at Clara. She was bent over the child, shielding her from the wind and rain with her own thin body, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. The child was as white as a sheet, her blue lips the only color on her face. I knew we were running out of time. I aimed the Jeep toward a section of the perimeter fence that I knew was weakened by rot. I didn't have the key to the back service gate, and I couldn't risk the sensors on the main entrance. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white and floored the accelerator. The Jeep surged forward, the engine wailing in protest as we crashed through the wooden pickets. The sound of splintering wood was deafening, a final, violent break from the life I had known. We fishtailed onto the narrow, slick back road that led away from the estate and toward the city lights in the distance. As I straightened the wheel and finally flicked on the high beams, the light cut through the deluge, revealing a world that had become unrecognizable. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the proud mother of a future judge. I was a fugitive, a rescuer, and an enemy of the Vance name. I pushed the Jeep to its limit, the speedometer needle dancing toward the red zone. Behind us, the estate was swallowed by the dark and the rain, but I knew Julian wouldn't be far behind. He would find the broken fence, and he would realize that his secrets were no longer contained. But as I looked at the dying child in the seat next to me, I knew there was no turning back. I would drive into the heart of the storm if it meant giving that little girl a chance to breathe. The war had moved from the shadows into the open, and I was ready to burn everything down to save the only innocent thing left of my family. The mud flew from the spinning tires of my old Jeep as I roared down the narrow gravel access road that led toward the back perimeter of the estate. The rain was a deafening roar against the canvas roof, and the wind shook the steering wheel in my hands. Beside me, Clara was huddled over the limp, burning body of the child, her whimpers lost in the mechanical howl of the engine. I pushed the pedal to the floor, my eyes searching the darkness for the final gate that would lead us to the public highway and the hospital. But as I rounded the final sharp bend near the old stone bridge, my heart plummeted into my stomach. Two blinding, surgical white LED headlights cut through the deluge, illuminating the rain like millions of falling diamonds. A sleek, black Mercedes sedan was parked horizontally across the narrow path, completely blocking the only exit. I slammed on the brakes, the Jeep fishtailing wildly on the slick gravel before coming to a jarring halt just inches from the Mercedes' pristine passenger door. The headlights of the sedan were so bright they felt like a physical weight against my eyes. I didn't have to wait to see who it was. The driver's door opened, and Julian stepped out into the pouring rain. He wasn't wearing a coat. His expensive silk shirt was instantly plastered to his frame, but he didn't seem to notice the cold or the wet. His face, usually a mask of practiced, professional calm, was twisted into something unrecognizable. It was the face of a man whose carefully constructed world was about to catch fire, and he looked capable of anything. He strode toward my window, his boots splashing through the deep puddles with a rhythmic, menacing thud. I rolled down the window just an inch, my hand white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "Move the car, Julian," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle against the storm. "This child is dying. She needs a doctor right now." Julian didn't look at the child. He didn't even look at Clara, who was shaking so hard the seat was rattling. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his eyes wide and bloodshot with a frantic, desperate rage. "You lied to me, Mother," he hissed, his voice a jagged blade that cut through the sound of the rain. "You took them from the shed. You went behind my back and dug up a grave that was supposed to stay closed. Do you have any idea what you've done? The final vetting for the judgeship is tomorrow morning. If a single soul sees that woman or that brat in your car, 38 years of work, everything I have built, everything you prided yourself on is gone in a heartbeat. She is your daughter, Julian, I screamed, the fury finally boiling over in my chest. She has the Vance flame on her wrist. She is gasping for air while you talk about a seat on a bench. Look at her. She is your own flesh and blood. Julian let out a harsh, jagged laugh that made my skin crawl. He slammed his fist against the frame of my door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped cabin of the Jeep. She is a mistake, he roared, the pretension of the prestigious lawyer finally stripped away. She is a biological error that should have never happened. My career, my future, the legacy of this family that is what is real, not some sickly brat from a common secretary. You are going to give them to me, Mother, right now. You are going to turn this car around, and we are going to fix this quietly, the way it should have been handled from the start. Fix it, I whispered, horror dawning on me. You want her to die. You're waiting for her to stop breathing so the problem goes away. Julian's expression turned cold and clinical, a terrifying stillness settling over his features. He reached out and gripped the top of my window, pulling himself closer until I could smell the expensive wine and the sharp tang of adrenaline on his breath. If you don't step out of this car and hand me those keys, I will have you committed by morning, he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal monotone. I have the signatures of 3 doctors who will swear you've succumbed to senile dementia. I will tell the world you kidnapped a woman and a child in a delusional fit. I will bury you in a state asylum so deep that no one will ever hear your name again. You are old, Eleanor. You are tired. Don't throw your life away for a girl who won't survive the night anyway. I looked at my son, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the man I had toasted at his graduation, and I realized he was already gone. There was nothing left of the person I loved. Standing before me was a monster who viewed human life as a transactional cost. I looked at Clara, who was staring at Julian with a look of such profound, soul-crushing terror that it gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I looked at the little girl, her tiny chest hitching in a desperate struggle for one more breath. I am a mother, Julian, I said, my voice suddenly calm and heavy with a terrible resolve. I raised a man, but I see now that I also raised a coward who is afraid of a 2-year-old girl. You think your career is worth more than her life? You think your title is worth more than my soul? I'm warning you, Mother. Julian screamed, his face turning a dark mottled purple as he reached through the gap in the window to grab the door handle from the inside. Give me the keys. This is my land. This is my life. No, Julian, I said, shifting the Jeep into gear and gripping the wheel until my knuckles felt like they would burst through the skin. This is her life. I looked him straight in the eyes, seeing the flicker of genuine panic as he realized I wasn't backing down. And I am going to save it, even if I have to drive right through you. I slammed my foot onto the accelerator, the engine let out a guttural roar, and the Jeep surged forward. I didn't care about the Mercedes. I didn't care about the asylum. I only cared about the heartbeat fading in the seat beside me, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to destroy my son to save my grandson's sister. The war was no longer silent. It was a collision of metal and will in the heart of the storm. The roar of the old Jeep's engine was a desperate, guttural howl that matched the primitive fury rising in my chest. Julian's hand was still gripping the top of my window, his knuckles white against the dark glass, his eyes wide and bloodshot with a manic, unyielding rage as he realization that I was not backing down. I didn't look at the black Mercedes sedan blocking the road. I didn't look at the expensive silk shirt now plastered to my son's body by the cold rain. I looked only at the faded, flame-shaped birthmark on the little girl's tiny, limp wrist, and I knew there was no other choice. With a primal scream of resolve that tore through my throat, I shifted the Jeep into gear and slammed my boot onto the accelerator, not letting off for a single second. The Jeep surged forward, the heavy steel grille crunching violently into the rear panel of Julian's pristine Mercedes. The sound was deafening, a cataclysm of splintering glass and folding metal that echoed through the dark pine forests. Julian's hand was ripped from the window as the impact spun the black sedan several feet, clearing just enough space for me to pass. I floored the pedal again, the Jeep groaning and lurching as it pushed through the gap, scraping its sides against the wreckage. As I drove past him, I rolled down the window and screamed into the storm, my voice cracking with a sorrow and a rage I had carried for 40 years. I raised a man, Julian. I raised a man, not a monster who prays for the death of his own daughter. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the rain-soaked road, surrounded by the debris of his career and my own past. He didn't chase after us. Perhaps he was stunned. Perhaps he was already on his tablet, making calls to have me committed as he had threatened. I didn't care. I straightened the Jeep on the gravel path and aimed it toward the city lights that glimmered like a low-hanging constellation in the distance. The suspension screamed and jolted over every rut, but I didn't slow down, not even when the speedometer needle danced near the red zone on the slick back road. Beside me, Clara was huddled over the child, a silent statue of terror. The only sound in the cramped cabin, other than the howl of the storm and the roar of the engine, was the little girl's breathing. It was a shallow, wet rattle that seemed to get weaker with every passing mile. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands felt numb, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, just asking for one more hour. Just one more hour to get her to a safe harbor before my son could reach us with his lies and his asylum papers. When we finally burst through the automatic glass doors of the municipal hospital in Munich, the contrast was blinding. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room triage bay felt like a surgical invasion after the hours of darkness. The smell of ozone, bleach, and sharp chemicals hit my nose, the specific smell of crisis I knew all too well as a retired nurse. I didn't wait to be triaged. I ran past the desk, cradling the tiny, limp bundle in my arms. A heavy-set nurse with tired eyes looked up, ready to begin the routine questions about insurance and ID. But when she saw the blue, the translucent skin of the girl's face, and the way her tiny chest struggled for one more breath, her professional demeanor vanished. She hit the red panic button. "Respiratory arrest in Bay 1, she shouted into the intercom, her voice echoing through the silent hallways. "We need PEDS, stat." Before I could even speak, a team of doctors and nurses descended upon us like a well-oiled machine. They snatched the child from my arms, laid her on a metal gurney, and wheeled her through a set of white swinging doors, disappearing from my sight. I was left standing in the center of the bay, my arms still curled into the shape of her small body, stunned by the sudden silence. Clara slid down the wall behind me, curling into a ball of grief on the polished linoleum floor. I sank into a hard plastic chair, feeling the adrenaline finally fade, replaced by a keen, heavy exhaustion and a dull ache in my back. I looked at the swinging doors and knew that the battle for my grandson's sister was now in the hands of strangers. A young resident with tired eyes and a green scrub cap came out a few minutes later. He looked at me with that professional sympathy that doctors develop over years of hard practice. "The child is in critical condition," he said, his voice low and firm. "She has pneumonia, severe malnutrition, and a congenital heart defect that's currently decompensating. Her temperature is 41 degrees. We have her on a ventilator, and we've started aggressive IV antibiotics and pressors to stabilize her blood pressure. I need to be honest with you, the odds are against her. The underlying heart issue needs urgent, expensive surgery. A specialized pediatric cardiac team has been called in." He paused, glancing at Clara and then at me. "I have to ask, what is the family's situation regarding insurance and ability to pay? This is a specialized, very high-cost intervention." I stood up, pulling my worn, heavy coat tighter around my waist. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out the small, blue savings book I had carried from the cottage. It contained the entire $150,000 from the sale of my apartment, the safety net I had put aside for a rainy day or a gift for my future grandchildren. I opened the book, displaying the final balance with a steady hand. "Do whatever you have to do, doctor," I said, handing him the book. "Take every single penny. If it's not enough, I'll sell the Jeep, I'll sell my blood, I'll sell whatever it takes. Just save her. How can a piece of paper be worth more than a single breath?" I have spent 40 years building a monument to a man who would let this child die. Don't let my failure be her death sentence." The doctor looked at the savings book, then at my face, and nodded slowly. He understood that I wasn't just paying for a surgery, I was buying a redemption. He turned and disappeared back through the swinging doors, leaving me alone in the sterile hallway with the echo of my last great gamble. The pennies were gone, but the real cost of saving my family was just beginning to be calculated. The sterile silence of the hospital corridor was shattered by the rhythmic, sharp clicking of designer heels against the polished linoleum. I looked up from my seat to see Madeline striding toward us. She looked like a specter from another world, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, her trench coat cinched tight, her face a mask of practiced, high society composure. But as she drew closer, I saw the frantic energy in her eyes, the way her fingers clutched her leather handbag until her knuckles turned white. Someone at the manor must have alerted her, or perhaps Julian had sent her to finish what he couldn't. She stopped a few feet from me, looking from my rain-drenched clothes to Clara, who was still huddled on the floor like a broken bird. "Eleanor, what in God's name is happening?" Madeline asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and a rising defensive anger. "Julian is at the estate in a state of total collapse. He says you've had a breakdown, that you've kidnapped a woman and a child. He's calling the family lawyers and the psychiatric evaluators. He told me to come here and bring you home before the press finds out. Why are you doing this to him? To us?" I stood up slowly, my joints aching from the cold and the adrenaline. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. On the drive to the hospital, the dash-mounted recording system in my old Jeep had captured every second of the confrontation at the bridge. I found the file and hit play. The volume was low, but in the echoing silence of the midnight hallway, Julian's voice sounded like a thunderclap. "She is a mistake," the recording roared, Julian's voice distorted by rage but unmistakable. "She is a biological error. My career, my future, the legacy of this family, that is what is real. I will have you committed by morning. I will tell the world you kidnapped a woman and a child in a delusional fit. I will bury you so deep no one will ever hear your name again." As the recording played, I watched Madeline's face. The mask of the perfect political wife didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of ash. Her mouth hung open slightly, her breath coming in short, jagged hitches as she heard her husband, the man she thought she knew, admit to a 3-year campaign of psychological torture and child endangerment just to protect a judicial seat. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. He said those things?" Madeline whispered, her eyes fixed on the phone in my hand. "He talked about a child dying as if it were a clerical error?" I didn't answer. Instead, I took her by the arm and led her toward the large observation window of the pediatric intensive care unit. "Look for yourself, Madeline," I said softly. Inside the glass bay, bathed in the harsh blue light of the medical monitors, lay the little girl. She was tangled in a web of IV lines and sensor wires, her tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Now that she was cleaned of the dirt from the shed, her features were terrifyingly clear. Madeline pressed her hand against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface. She gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated, soul-crushing pain. It was impossible to deny. The girl had Julian's stubborn chin, his high forehead, and the exact shape of the eyes Madeline saw every morning across the breakfast table. It was a miniature, female version of the man she loved, born from a betrayal she had never suspected. For a woman who had spent 5 years and a fortune on fertility treatments, who had prayed every night for a miracle that never came, seeing her husband's secret child gasping for life was a cruelty beyond words. I saw Madeline's knees buckle for a moment, her expensive coat brushing against the floor as she leaned into the glass for support. She was a powerful woman, a CEO who handled multi-million-dollar mergers with a steady hand. But in this moment, she was just a betrayed wife looking at the wreckage of her life. A single heavy tear escaped her eye and rolled down the glass. She stayed like that for a long minute, her forehead pressed against the window, staring at the child who carried her husband's blood but not her own. Then, something shifted. I watched as her posture straightened, her shoulders squaring with a cold, terrifying precision. The grief didn't disappear, but it was overlaid by a layer of indestructible steel. She turned away from the window and looked at me. Her eyes were no longer swimming with confusion. They were sharp, dry, and filled with a lethal clarity. She looked at Clara, then back at me, and finally at the phone containing the recording. "Julian is a fool," Madeline said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that I had heard her use in boardrooms to silence her critics. "He thinks he can manage this like a PR crisis. He thinks I'm a prop in his theater." She reached into her bag and pulled out her own phone, her fingers moving with a swift, businesslike efficiency. "Eleanor, give me a copy of that recording and the DNA results you mentioned. I want everything." "What are you going to do?" I asked, watching her with a mixture of fear and hope. "I am going to end him," she said, and for the first time I saw the true power of the woman my son had married. He didn't just betray me with the secretary, he betrayed the very idea of a family. He wanted this child to die so he could sit on a bench and judge others. I will make sure the only bench he ever sits on is a wooden one in a prison cell. I have the connections to bypass his friends in the judiciary. My father's firm owns the media outlets that are supposed to endorse him tomorrow. By sunrise, Julian Vance will not be a candidate. He will be a pariah. She walked over to Clara and knelt down, not caring that her silk dress was touching the dirty floor. She took Clara's hand in hers, a billionaire's daughter holding the hand of a woman who had lived in a shed. "I am so sorry," Madeline whispered, and for a second the steel in her voice broke. "I didn't know. I promise you, he will never touch you or this child again. You are under my protection now." Madeline stood up and looked at the ICU doors one last time. The pity was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking with a renewed, predatory purpose. I realized then that my son had made the ultimate mistake. He had underestimated the women in his life. He thought we were ornaments to his success, but he had just turned us into the architects of his destruction. The judgment had begun, and it wasn't coming from a court of law. It was coming from the broken heart of a wife and the weary soul of a mother. The sunrise that followed that terrible night did not bring warmth, only a cold, revealing light that stripped away the last of the Vance family illusions. While I sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee, the world outside was being dismantled by Madeline with a precision that was as quiet as it was lethal. She did not scream, and she did not hesitate. Within 3 hours of leaving the pediatric ward, she had mobilized the full, crushing weight of her father's industrial empire. By 8 a.m., every joint bank account Julian possessed had been frozen. Every credit line associated with the Vance name was severed, and the massive campaign fund that was supposed to propel him to the federal bench was effectively seized by the family trust that provided its backing. Julian, unaware of the storm that had already made landfall, had gone to his prestigious law firm in the center of Munich to prepare for his final vetting. He likely thought he could still manage the mother problem with a few calls to his psychiatric contacts. But as he sat in his corner office, surrounded by leather-bound books and mahogany furniture, the locks on his world were being changed from the outside. Madeline had already filed for an emergency divorce on the grounds of extreme moral turpitude, and more importantly, she had walked into the Central Police headquarters not as a victim, but as a whistleblower. She handed over the DNA results, the forensic report on the blood-stained necklace, and the chilling audio recording from my Jeep. The collapse happened with a speed that felt like a physical shock. I watched it unfold on the small television mounted in the hospital waiting room. A fleet of black police vans pulled up to the curb of the city's most prominent legal tower. The news crews, originally gathered there to document Julian's triumphant march toward the judgeship, were suddenly capturing a very different story. The visual core of his life, the image of the untouchable, righteous arbiter of law, was shattered in front of millions. The cameras caught the exact moment the elevator doors opened in the lobby. Julian was led out in handcuffs, his expensive navy suit rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his face a mask of panicked, sweating desperation. He wasn't the future judge anymore. He was a common criminal being charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and felony child endangerment. He tried to hide his face behind his cuffed hands, but the flashing bulbs of the photographers caught every flinch. The reporters who had praised him only 24 hours ago were now shouting questions about the shed girl and the secret daughter he had left to die. Seeing him like that, stripped of his dignity and his power, did not bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, I felt a profound, hollow grief. I saw the ghost of the little boy I used to hold, the one I had taught to be kind, and I realized that man had died a long time ago, consumed by an ambition that left no room for a soul. Julian looked toward the cameras, and for a split second, I saw his eyes. There was no remorse in them, only a burning, feral hatred for the world that had finally refused to believe his lies. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing that the silver tongue that had won him so many cases could not talk his way out of the truth recorded in his own voice. Madeline stood a few yards away from the police line, watched by a phalanx of her own security detail. She didn't look at him as they shoved him into the back of the transport van. She looked through him as if he were already a ghost. She had erased him from her life with the same clinical efficiency he had used to erase Clara. By noon, his name had been scrubbed from the law firm's brass plaque, and his campaign posters were being torn down from the city streets. The Vance monument had fallen, not because of a political rival or a legal technicality, but because the truth had finally found a way out of the shadows. Back at the hospital, the atmosphere had shifted. The nurses who had been wary of us now looked at Clara and me with a mixture of awe and deep pity. We were no longer the odd group from the Bavarian hills. We were the survivors of a nightmare that had gripped the nation's headlines. I went back to the ICU observation window and watched the little girl. She was still fighting, her tiny heart beating a steady rhythm against the odds. She was the only thing that mattered now. The wealth, the estate, and the prestigious career of Julian Vance were nothing more than ash in the wind. As the news cycle churned with the details of his arrest, I realized that the perfect mask had not just slipped, it had been ground into the dirt by the very people Julian thought he controlled. My son was a prisoner of his own making, and for the first time in 40 years, I breathed air that wasn't thick with the scent of his deception. The monument was gone, but the foundation of a new, honest life was beginning to emerge from the ruins. The dust from the explosion of my old life had finally settled, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the possibility of a clean start. After the trial and the media frenzy that stripped Julian of his title, his freedom, and his future, there was nothing left for us in the shadowed hills of Bavaria. The sprawling equestrian estate, once a monument to my pride, had been sold off to satisfy the mountain of legal debts and settlements Madeline had orchestrated with surgical precision. I took what was left of my spirit, Clara's fragile hope, and the tiny, miraculous life we had saved, and I crossed the ocean. I needed a place where the air tasted of salt instead of ancient lies, a place where the Vance name was just another word in a phone book and not a brand of cold perfection. We settled in a small, weathered town on the coast of Maine, a place of jagged cliffs, stubborn pines, and a sea that never stopped whispering. I used the remaining funds from the sale of my cottage and the kindness of a few distant connections to secure a modest shingled house within walking distance of the harbor. Here, I am no longer the mother of a prestigious federal judge or a witness to a hidden crime. I am simply Eleanor, a woman with silver hair and a steady hand who works 4 days a week at the Anchor's Page, a cramped, wood-scented bookstore that smells of old paper and sea salt. My hands, once built for the heavy labor of a head nurse and the frantic pruning of a deceptive garden, now find peace in the quiet act of shelving novels and recommending stories of resilience to the locals. Clara has begun to heal, though the scars on her soul are deep and require a different kind of nursing than a hospital can provide. She works in a local bakery, her hands covered in flour as she kneads dough, a rhythmic, grounding task that seems to help her reclaim her place in the world of the living. She is still quiet, still prone to flinching when a door slams too hard, but she no longer looks like a ghost. She has a color in her cheeks that matches the blooming heather on the Maine coastline, and for the first time in 3 years, I see her smile when she looks at her daughter. We named the little girl Hope, a name that felt like a bridge over the abyss we had crawled out of. She is 4 years old now, and the blue tint that once haunted her lips has been replaced by the vibrant flush of a healthy, energetic child. Her heart, once so fragile and failing, was repaired by the hands of the surgeons I paid with my life savings, and now it beats with a stubborn, joyful rhythm. Every afternoon, after I finish my shift at the bookstore, I walk down to the narrow strip of gray sand near our house and watch her. She is a force of nature, running through the surf with a wild, uninhibited glee, her blonde curls dancing in the Atlantic breeze. She digs for sea glass and chases the gulls, her laughter a bright silver sound that echoes against the granite rocks. I look at her tiny wrist, where the flame-shaped birthmark is still visible, a permanent reminder of the bloodline that tried to extinguish her. But in this light, under the vast, honest sky of New England, it no longer feels like a curse. It looks like a badge of survival. I see Julian's features in her stubborn chin and her sharp, intelligent eyes, but I am determined to ensure that is where the resemblance ends. I am raising her to know that her worth is not found in a prestigious title or a glass manor, but in the kindness she shows to others and the truth she carries in her heart. Madeline visits us twice a year, arriving in a quiet, unassuming car that is a far cry from the black Mercedes of our past life. She has undergone her own transformation, having stepped away from the industrial empire of her father to run a foundation for vulnerable women and children. She carries a heavy burden of guilt for the years she spent living in the glow of Julian's success while Clara was suffering in the shadows, but she is working to redeem that debt with every gift she brings. She doesn't arrive with expensive jewelry or designer clothes. Instead, she brings books for hope, handcrafted wooden toys, and a quiet, sincere humility. We sit on the porch together, drinking tea and watching the tide come in, two women who were once strangers bound by a common lie, now allies bound by a shared truth. There is a profound, quiet beauty in this simple existence. My soul, once so heavy with the weight of my son's ambition, feels as clear as the coastal air. I lost a son to the darkness of his own making, a tragedy that I will mourn until my last breath, but I gained a granddaughter and a chance to witness the miracle of a life restored. I have learned that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of integrity. As I watch Hope stumble over a piece of driftwood and pick herself up with a determined grin, I realize that this small, honest life is the greatest legacy I could ever leave. The monument has fallen, the secrets are buried, and in their place, a garden of genuine love has finally begun to grow. The sun is beginning to dip below the horizon of the Atlantic, casting a long, golden path across the gray waters of the Maine coast. As I sit here on my small wooden porch, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan that smells of the sea and old books, I can hear the distant, joyful shrieks of Hope playing with a neighbor's dog on the beach. It is a sound that once felt like an impossible dream, a melody that was nearly silenced in a rotting shed thousands of miles away. I look at my weathered hands, the skin spotted with age and the calluses earned from honest work, and I realize that these hands have done more good in the last few years than in all the decades I spent polishing the image of a man who didn't exist. I have lived a long life, and for a very long time, I believed that my son's success was the ultimate measure of my worth as a mother. I equated Julian's prestigious titles, his flawless reputation, and his high society marriage with my own success in raising him. I thought that by building a monument to his career, I was fulfilling my duty to the Vance bloodline. But life taught me a brutal, bone-shattering lesson that stripped away every vanity I held dear. I lost the successful son I thought I knew, a man who turned out to be a hollow shell of ambition and cruelty. I lost the comfort of the Bavarian estate and the pride of being the mother of a future judge. Yet, in the wreckage of that collapse, I found something far more precious. I found my own conscience. I think back to that fog-drenched night when I first heard the scratching behind the shed door. If I had listened to the voice of fear, or the voice of family loyalty that Julian tried to weaponize against me, I would still be living in that cottage, a silent accomplice to a slow-motion murder. I would be a proud mother, presiding over a house built on the bones of a woman and a child. The thought makes my blood run cold even now. I realized then, and I know with a terrifying certainty now, that a family held together by lies is not a family at all. It is a conspiracy. We were living in a glass manor, but the air inside was poison. Money and power can build magnificent castles, but they are cold, echoing places where the heart goes to die. Julian had everything the world told him he should want: wealth, influence, and a seat on the highest bench, but he was bankrupt in every way that truly mattered. He viewed people as transactional costs and his own daughter as a biological error. Now, as he sits in a prison cell, stripped of his silk suits and his gold watch, he is finally forced to live with the person he truly is, without the mask I helped him wear for so long. I do not hate him, for hate is too heavy a burden for a woman my age to carry, but I mourn the boy he used to be. I buried that boy the night I drove through the Mercedes to save the girl. My life now is quiet, simple, and infinitely richer. I am a gardener again, but I am no longer pruning dead roses to hide the rot of an estate. I am growing my granddaughter's soul. I am teaching her that the most important inheritance I can leave her isn't a bank account or a deed to a property, but a legacy of integrity. I want her to grow up knowing that a clear conscience is the only pillow that stays soft through the hardest nights. I want her to understand that truth is not just a concept we talk about in courtrooms. It is the very breath of a life worth living. To those of you listening to my story from thousands of miles away, perhaps in the bustling streets of Berlin or a quiet corner of the American Midwest, I want to leave you with this. Do not wait until your world collapses to look at the foundations of your own home. Do not be blinded by the glittering masks of success and the hollow promises of prestige. We live in a world that often prizes the eternal star of wealth over the flickering flame of a human heart, but I am here to tell you that the flame is all that remains when the lights go out. Cherish the honesty in your relationships, even when it is painful. Embrace the truth, even when it threatens to tear down the castles you have built. Because at the end of the day, when the tide comes in and the sun sets on your life, you will not care about the titles you held or the money you made. You will only care about the people you loved and the people you were brave enough to save. Money can build a house, but only the truth can create a home. I am Eleanor Vance, and I have lost a dynasty but gained a family. As the stars begin to appear over the Maine coast, I feel a peace that no judgeship could ever provide. I am finally living my own story, not someone else's nightmare. Take care of each other, hold your loved ones close, and never, ever be afraid to choose a human soul over a piece of jewelry. It is never too late to start over, and it is never too late to be honest. Thank you for sharing this heavy burden with me tonight. My heart is full, and for the first time in 62 years, it is finally truly free.